In this video, we'll discuss the twilight of the New Deal and Roosevelt's issues with the Supreme Court. Roosevelt took the presidential oath again on January 20th, 1937, instead of the traditional March 4th. The 20th Amendment was ratified in 1933, and this swept away the post-election lame duck session of Congress and shortened by 6 weeks the awkward period before the inauguration. Roosevelt interpreted his re-election as a mandate to continue the New Deal. To him, the Supreme Court judges were stumbling blocks, and in 9 major cases involving the New Deal, they had thwarted the New Deal reforms 7 times. The court was ultra-conservative. 6 of the 9 judges were over 70 years old. Roosevelt had not appointed anyone to the court in his first term, and some justices held on primarily to curb the socialistic New Deal programs. FDR believed the voters in the presidential elections of 1932 and 1936 and congressional elections of 1934 had clearly demonstrated their support for the New Deal. To FDR, the court was obstructing democracy. Roosevelt hit on a scheme to fix the problem. This proved to be one of his most costly political misjudgments. He asked Congress for legislation to permit him to add a new justice to the Supreme Court for every one over 70 who would not retire. Maximum membership would then be 15. He alleged the court was far behind in its work, which proved to be false, and he brought accusations of dishonesty. The headstrong FDR did not realize that the court, in popular thinking, had become a sacred cow. This is a political cartoon showing the response to Roosevelt's court-packing plan in 1937, showing the Democratic donkey kicking up a storm in opposition to President Roosevelt's plan to expand the Supreme Court in what was called his court-packing scheme to as many as 15 judges. Congress and the nation convulsed over this court-packing plan, and FDR was vilified for attempting to break the delicate checks and balances among the 3 branches. He was accused of grooming himself as a dictator while trying to browbeat the judiciary. And to Republicans and some Democrats, the basic liberties seemed in jeopardy. The court saw an axe hanging over its head, and Justice Owen Roberts, a conservative, began to vote with his liberal colleagues. In 1937, the court upheld the principle of the state minimum wage for women, reversing its 1936 decision. In succeeding decisions, the court became more sympathetic to the New Deal programs. They upheld the National Labor Relations Act and the Social Security Act. So Roosevelt's court packing was further undermined when Congress voted full pay for justices over 70 who retired. This was one of the oldest, at that time, one of the oldest conservatives resigned and was replaced by a New Dealer, Justice Hugo Black. Congress finally passed the court reform bill. It was a watered-down version which applied only to lower courts, but Roosevelt suffered his first major legislative defeat at the hands of his own party in Congress. Eventually, the court became markedly more friendly to the New Deal reforms. The succession of deaths and resignations enabled him to make 9 appointments to the tribunal, more than any of his predecessors since George Washington. So the clock and time had unpacked the court itself. Yet, in a sense, FDR lost both the court battle and the war. He so aroused the conservatives of both parties in Congress that few New Deal reforms passed after 1937, which was the year of the fight to pack the bench. And with this catastrophic miscalculation, he squandered much of that goodwill that carried him to victory in the 1936 election. The twilight of the New Deal is during this time period, and Roosevelt's first term did not banish the Depression. The unemployment persisted in 1936 at about 15%, which was down from 25% in 1933, but still was high, and recovery had been modest. Then in 1937, the economy took another sharp downturn. A surprising severe depression within the Depression that critics dubbed the Roosevelt recession took place. The government policies caused a nosedive. Just as the new Social Security taxes began to take effect, FDR cut government spending to try to balance the budget. In this figure, this shows the economic impact of the Great Depression on the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany in 1929 to 1940. And you can see this on the figure, but I'll explain on the other slide. It shows that the Federal Emergency Relief Administration workers are counted as employed. The figure also shows registered unemployment in Germany in 1929. Industrial unemployment, as reported by the unions, was 13.1%. It showed that unemployment ceased to be an issue in Germany by 1939 with the mobilization of war. And this is an average of the industrial indexes in the United Kingdom for the first 6 months of 1939 only. Thereafter, no figures are available until 1946. Roosevelt then deliberately embraced the ideas of the British economist John Maynard Keynes. FDR announced the bold program to stimulate the economy by planned deficit spending. Keynesianism, which was the use of government spending and fiscal policy to prime the pump of the economy and encourage consumer spending. This policy became the new economic orthodoxy and remained so for decades. Roosevelt continued to push the remaining reform measures of the New Deal, and he urged Congress to authorize sweeping reorganizations of national administrations in the interest of efficiency. This was not done, and thus he faced another defeat. 2 years later, Congress partially relented and passed the Reorganization Act, which gave the president some powers for administrative reforms, including key new executive offices in the White House. The Hatch Act in 1939 was passed, which barred federal officials, except the highest policy-making officers, from actively politically campaigning and soliciting. It forbade the use of government funds for political purposes, and it forbade the collection of campaign contributions from people receiving relief payments. The Hatch Act was broadened in 1940 as well, placing limits on campaign contributions and expenditures, and after some found ways around it, the legislation proved fairly disappointing. By 1938, the New Deal had lost its momentum. Roosevelt could find very few new reforms. In the congressional elections of 1938, the Republicans scored victories but failed to gain control in either house. Foreign affairs increasingly dominated the public debate. This is John Maynard Keynes. He rose to international prominence as a macroeconomist who argued that governments should intervene in times of recession by boosting aggregate demand through deficit spending. Roosevelt applies this approach and makes it the official U.S. policy in 1937. The foes of the New Deal were condemned. They condemned the New Deal. They said they alleged that it was wasteful, incompetence, confusion, too many contradictions, and too many cross purposes, as well as graft in alphabetical agencies. Alphabet soup was what Al Smith called it. They deplored the employment of the crackpot college professors, leftist pinkos, and outright communists, and they claimed that the New Dealers were trying to make the United States over in a Bolshevik Marxist image under Rooseveltsky. Roosevelt was accused of being Jewish, and they called him Rosenfeld, and tapping too many Jewish leftists, which they nicknamed the Jew Deal, for his drain trust. Business people were shocked by the leap before you look, try anything once spirit. The bureaucratic meddling and regimentation were bitter complaints of anti-New Dealers, and the federal government, with all its employees, became incomparably the largest single business in the country under the New Deal. Promises of budget balancing flew out the window, with the national debt going from a mere $19 billion to skyrocketing in 1939 to $40 billion. America became the handout state, people feared, and the U.S. and the United States, some said, stood for unlimited spending. Businessmen were bitter. They accused the New Deal of fomenting class strife. They accused conservatives insisted that laborers and farmers were being pampered. Businessmen wanted the government off their backs, and private enterprise was being stifled by the planned economy, planned bankruptcy, and creeping socialism. States' rights were ignored while government competed in business with its own citizens under the dictatorship of do-gooders. Roosevelt's leadership was denounced as a one-man supergovernment. They took heavy fire against attempts to browbeat the Supreme Court and create the dummy Congress. They tried to purge Congress of Democrats who would not march in lockstep with FDR, and 3 senators whom he publicly opposed were all reelected. The most damning indictment of the New Deal was that it failed to cure the Depression. Floating in a sea of red ink, it had only administered aspirin, sedatives, and Band-Aids. $20 billion poured out in 6 years of deficit spending and lending, but the gap was not closed between production and consumption. More farm surplus existed under Roosevelt than under Hoover, and millions were still unemployed in 1939 after 6 years of drain, strain, and pain. The New Dealers staunchly defended their record. They said there was some waste, but they pointed out that relief, not economy, had been the primary objective. They said there was some graft, but argued that it had been trivial in the view of the immense sums that were spent and the obvious need for haste. The New Deal relieved the worst of the crisis of 1933. They promoted the philosophy of balancing the human budget. The Washington regime was to be used, not feared. They said the collapse of America's economic system was averted, that a fairer distribution of national income had been achieved, and that citizens were able to regain and retain their self-respect. Though hated by business tycoons, FDR should have been their patron saint. He deflected popular resentments against business. He may have saved the American system of free enterprise. His quarrel was not with capitalism, but with the capitalists. He purged American capitalism of some of its worst abuses, headed off a radical swing to the left, claimed that the New Deal did not bankrupt the United States, and had a massive national debt caused by World War II, not by the New Deal. The national debt would be $40 billion in 1939, but would rise to $258 billion in 1945 as a result of World War II. FDR provided bold reform without bloody revolution. Upbraided by the left-wing radicals for not going far enough, and by right-wing radicals for going too far. So he was pretty much damned if he did, and damned if he didn't. Choosing the middle road, Roosevelt had been called the greatest American conservative since Alexander Hamilton. Hamiltonians, in espousal of big government, were like FDR, but he was also Jeffersonian in concern for the forgotten man. So he was a good mix between both. Demonstrating the value of presidential leadership, he exercised his power to relieve the erosion of the nation's greatest resource, which was its people. And he helped preserve democracy in America at a time when democracies abroad were disappearing to dictatorships. He unwittingly girded the nation for its part in the titanic war that loomed on the horizon, a war in which democracy, the world over, would be at stake. This is a picture of FDR. It's a pro-FDR cartoon called Our Skipper, which depicts Roosevelt ignoring his critics while heading cheerily towards economic recovery. And this is the chronology from the chapter.